So my topic, as you will know, is the Eisenhower Presidency. And, Ike is a really important figure in so many ways. But the reality, I think, is that if I, put up this slide in your classrooms, a lot of your students wouldn't really know who this man is. They might recognize, well, that looks like a general. He was probably a World War II general. This man on the right just looks like a dignified figure. It's not altogether clear that many of your students would immediately know that this is Dwight D. Eisenhower. If they could name him, if they did know, oh, that's Eisenhower, they might not know a great deal about him. Maybe they would know that he was, a World War II figure, or that he was kind of old, or maybe that he played golf, or that he had a big smile, these kinds of caricatures that are kind of in the popular culture. But unfortunately, Eisenhower is, for better or for worse, often overshadowed by some of his much more, sort of acclaimed and famous predecessors, Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman, of course, who guided the country through the Great Depression and the Second World War. And then John Kennedy, who came after Eisenhower and, who's just so charming, handsome, sort of exquisite in his carriage and everything, and just he still has the power to dazzle us. And coming right after Eisenhower, poor old Ike, really could never compete with the beauty of John Kennedy. So Ike is sometimes overshadowed. And look, that's okay, because there is a great deal about Eisenhower, and in particular the 1950s, that is left to us to bring back to life. And there's a lot of really cool material that I think we can work with to make Eisenhower, and in particular the 50s, exciting, interesting, compelling for you and your students. So my question is, how can we make Eisenhower an exciting and compelling topic of interest for students who are doing a kind of survey of 20th century America, and who are probably much more likely to know something about World War II, or maybe the Kennedy period, and maybe a little fuzzy on the 50s. What can we do to bring some life to it and to bring some interest to it? So obviously, the one easy way to begin when you're dealing with an age that's defined by one individual is just to touch a little bit on biography. So I'll just, I'll mention, I'll start with just a couple of biographical details about Eisenhower, that the kind of things that you might well yourself do. So Eisenhower, one thing about Ike that one of your very bright students might know is that he is one of only two US presidents actually born in Texas, the other being Lyndon Johnson. Eisenhower was born in Denison, Texas in 1890. His family, his parents had gone to Texas from Kansas in search of work. They were there only a couple of years. They couldn't find much work. And they went back to the family, sort of, clan, who lived in Abilene, Kansas. In Abilene, Kansas in 1890, when Ike was young and growing up, was a small town, but it was a fairly active little town in the West. It was a railroad junction. It was a town to which a lot of people drove their cattle to be put on trains, and then they would be carried to Kansas City and Chicago. So it had some activity. It had an active church life. It had a dozen local newspapers. It had a big high school that Eisenhower would attend. But Eisenhower and his family were poor. I mean, they lived on the wrong side of the tracks. Eisenhower's father worked in a manual labor at a local dairy creamery. The family really was just one bad day or an accident away from real poverty. So Eisenhower grew up knowing the value of work, the value of a paycheck, but also that gnawing sense of fear that things were not always going to be easy. In fact, things might never be easy. And I think this is central to his character, and I think it was also central to his political appeal, that he had come up in tough times, working really, really hard in a family of 6 brothers. They weren't poverty-stricken or destitute. They ate, they clothed themselves, but they worked tirelessly just to get by. And I think that's something that is a crucial element of some of the leaders of his generation. They really knew tough times. The family, the house that they lived in, which is still, you can go visit in Abilene, looks quite comfortable, but it had 3 bedrooms and they had 6 boys and 2 parents, and Eisenhower shared a bed. He shared a bed until he left for college. So, they didn't have any luxuries. And I think this is something that he used as part of his political biography. He liked to say, we were poor, but the great thing about America in those days was we didn't know it. And that's something to think about. Why is it that we know so much about what the other guy has nowadays? Whereas back in the teens and in the 20s, it really what they had in Abilene was their world. That was the world they knew, and they were comfortable in it. Well, Eisenhower was a smart kid. He was a good athlete. He decided he wanted to go to college. He didn't have enough money to pay for college, so he applied to the military academy at West Point. He was accepted, and off he went to West Point, where he was a real success. He was a football player. He was a popular person. He wasn't necessarily the best student, but he was a popular leader. You know, he had a gift. He had a lot of charisma. He had a lot of poise. He was an outstanding athlete, a very strong person. He was often referred to in the newspapers as the giant Kansan in the reporting on football. Well, I'm not going to dwell too much on his career before his presidency, but he goes into the Army after he leaves West Point, and of course he'll rise to become one of the most prominent American generals of our history. It is worth, before I get into the 50s, it is worth, I think, stressing to your students that World War II, the time that made Eisenhower's career, was, of course, a time of extraordinary sacrifice and hardship for millions of Americans. You know, 16 million Americans put on a uniform and served in some capacity. Not all of those went abroad, of course, but many did go overseas, and many suffered in combat or in other kinds of service during the war. And back on the home front, it was rationing, it was shortages, it was discipline and difficult times. And I think that we tend to mythologize the World War II a little bit too much, and we have to recall that the people who came through it had gone through the Depression and the Second World War and really had a sense when they got to the 1950s that they'd entered a kind of paradise. Because suddenly it felt as if peace and genuine prosperity had really come. But they always had a gnawing fear that maybe things could turn again and things could get bad again. And that sense of having gone through the traumas of the 30s and the 40s was very real for Eisenhower in particular. Well, Ike, here is Ike in his military grandeur, looking very sharp, as he did, wearing the famous Eisenhower jacket that was so nicely cinched in at the waist. He was a commanding figure. One of the things that I learned about him, working on him, was that people thought of him as having huge amounts of charisma. We usually see him in black and white photographs, but he had a very distinctive colored, complexion. He was athletic. He walked forward. He had big hands. People always talked about how much charisma Eisenhower had. Anyway, Ike decides to go into politics. We can come back to why he did that. But in 1952, he decides to run for president. And he did so, I think, because he really believed that the Democratic Party of Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman had simply been in office for too long, and the government had gotten too big, and there needed to be a period of conservative leadership, Republican leadership, that could swing the pendulum back towards the center. It had gone too far to the progressive causes of the New Deal and the Fair Deal, and Eisenhower wanted to bring it back to the center. He and his vice presidential running mate, Richard Nixon, who was only 39 when they ran for office in 1952, they won in a landslide, as you can see from this slide. Why did Eisenhower win in a landslide? Partly it was his personality and his optimism and his reputation from the war, but also Eisenhower ran as a conservative. He ran as a small government conservative, and that was a message that American voters really hadn't heard for a long time. And they responded quite well to it in 1952, and they would again in 1956. Well, I want to take you now into the 50s and Eisenhower's presidency, and I just have 4 themes that I want to give you, and I have just 4 slides that each summarize these themes. My idea here was to talk about, topics that you could legitimately think about teaching and try to make sense of Eisenhower and the 1950s. And so I have 4 topics that I think each one of which would make a nice little unit with a very easy amount of gathering of additional materials. What is it that defines the 50s? So my first theme that I wanted to point to is I'm titling The Shadow of War. So of course, the key fact of the 1950s and of the Eisenhower years is that war hangs over the entire decade, and especially the beginning of the decade. So while it was eventually considered an era of peace and prosperity, at the very beginning of the decade, in fact, the United States was at war. And it was at war not just in Korea, but it was at war in a sense in the Cold War. The Cold War hung over the entire decade of the 50s. During the 50s, really, the Cold War was at its most dangerous. A time when anything could have gone wrong, in which the 2 great powers didn't really know each other and could easily have made a mistake. So the 50s was overshadowed by this sense of fear, a sense of worry about international affairs, and the real anxiety that comes with sending young men, young American men abroad once again in yet another war. So the Korean War, which broke out in 1950 and would run up to 1953, was a major source of anxiety in the United States in the early part of the decade. About 35,000 Americans were killed in the Korean War, 120,000 or so were wounded there, and many more were drafted. And so Americans were once again, at the beginning of the decade, suiting up for war, which is something to think about. Like, that works against our notion of the 50s as this easy time when everybody was just eating hot dogs and having, cookouts and going to baseball games. In fact, it began under the shadow of a very real and very unpopular war. The war in Korea was unpopular in part because people didn't know why we were fighting it. It was not well explained. What was America doing in Korea? And why did we have to sacrifice Americans once again for a country, a faraway country that we didn't really understand? This was a real drag. Eisenhower came into office in 1953, was determined to end the war, and he signed an armistice agreement that meant that the fighting stopped. But as you all know, the war really never stopped. It's kind of still going on today. Korea is partitioned, and the border between North and South Korea is arguably the most dangerous place in the world. But as far as the public was concerned, Eisenhower ended the Korean War. American troops would stop being sent there and stop being killed there. So that was a popular move. The other element of this period, the shadow of war, was the nuclear arms race, which was a very anxious time. The United States had developed and used the atomic bomb, but in the early 1950s, the United States and the Soviet Union were both building more and more powerful weapons. The thermonuclear weapon, or the hydrogen bomb, was tested in the early 1950s. These bombs were 1,000 times more powerful than the weapons that were used in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And Americans knew this. So they lived under the shadow of, literally under the shadow of a mushroom cloud. And they worried terribly that possibly they were drifting towards yet another use of atomic weapons, but maybe against the United States. And so you had the opportunity to talk to your kids about what it would be like to live in this environment of threat and fear, because in the 1950s, of course, the United States government spent a great deal of time trying to explain and to normalize nuclear weapons through civil defense training films and duck and cover drills of the kind I know you probably used in your courses before. But this was a very real source of constant sort of anxiety. And then a third source of anxiety in the 1950s was the legitimate fear of communist subversion inside the United States. The American government had announced that, sure enough, they had found communists inside the United States government. Their communists had penetrated into the Los Alamos nuclear weapons laboratory. They had penetrated into the State Department, the Treasury. This was very real security threat. And as you know, some politicians used this fear, exploited this fear, Joseph McCarthy of Wisconsin, for example, for their own political purposes. But the reality is that the US government, including Eisenhower, sent a message to the public that communism was a dangerous and insidious ideology in which people might do secret things and sabotage the government and spy on the government, and that we had to look out for communist subversion of our institutions. And that included Hollywood, the movies, it included the media. The government was on the lookout for communist subversion of universities and teachers and of unions. Ronald Reagan made his first public sort of breakthrough, not as an actor so much, but as an anti-communist actor. He denounced communists in Hollywood. So the fear of war, nuclear weapons, and of internal subversion is a big theme of the age of Eisenhower. I think it's something you could fruitfully work with on your students. What were Americans really afraid of in the 1950s? That might be a good question to pose. The second theme of the 1950s, and I know you guys know this very well, and you've probably taught this unit many times. I probably don't need to belabor this point, but it is central to the age of Eisenhower. It's central to the decade of the 1950s, is the struggle for racial justice. And anytime you talk about Eisenhower and the 50s, you have to include the extraordinary progress that was made in the field of civil rights. Obviously, the great legal breakthroughs, the legislative breakthroughs would come in the 1960s, but the amazing achievements of the 50s only partially have to do with Eisenhower's own agency. I like to stress the fact that the agency really was Black Americans who were pushing the progress in civil rights. I do think that whenever you deal with these questions, you have to explain to young people what the Jim Crow system really was, and how segregation was a fact of life for over a century from the era after the Civil War right up through the middle of the 1950s. Jim Crow segregation defined not just the South, but all of the United States. It defined the way our cities were built, the way our suburbs were built. It defined our public schools, our universities. It defined our culture. It defined the way we went to hotels or rode on public trains and buses. Jim Crow segregation was everywhere. And it would suffer a mortal blow during the decade of the 1950s. So the first thing I think that's really important to emphasize is the Brown versus Board of Education case and the results, which overturned the segregation of public schools. It determined that the separate but equal theory, that you could have schools for Black children and schools for white children provided they were the same, it blew that up and said that was unconstitutional under the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. So Brown versus Board has its own history. It was the end point of a long process of Black lawyers and the NAACP with a legal strategy pushing and testing the theory of separate but equal. And it came to a head at the Supreme Court in 1954. Eisenhower plays an important role in this story in this way. It was he who appointed the Chief Justice, Earl Warren, who wrote the decision, and it was a unanimous decision. And when Eisenhower appointed Warren, he did know that Warren was something of a liberal on civil rights. He knew what he was doing, and he knew this decision or this case was already in the pipeline. So I believe, not everybody believes this, but I believe Eisenhower played a secondary role in opening the door for Brown v. Board to go forward. So it's a landmark decision and absolutely central. You can't really overstate the importance of the idea of making public schools open to all people, to destroy the argument of separate but equal. The Brown decision is just the beginning, of course, but it was the beginning for a legal strategy to keep pressing, keep challenging Jim Crow. Down in Montgomery, Alabama, soon after the Brown decision, in 1955, a group of civil rights activists, of course, led by Martin Luther King Jr. and other local activists, tested the segregation by race on public buses in Montgomery. They staged a bus boycott. And there's Rosa Parks sitting on a bus in Montgomery. And this brought national attention, again, embarrassing international attention, to the fact that throughout the South, public transportation was still segregated. And working both publicly in these confrontations of activism and also through the courts, they brought a pressure to bear on the cities and states that practiced segregation on public transportation. They spent a year boycotting the buses in Montgomery. They walked, they did carpools, they refused to ride the buses, and they pressured the courts. And at the end of 1956, the Supreme Court also supported the desegregation of public transportation in public transportation. So these were enormous breakthroughs, and they combined activism with a legal strategy. Obviously, there was a huge degree of resistance and of reaction to the gradual progress of the NAACP and other activists pushing for desegregation. And there was massive resistance all across the South. There was an effort to keep schools segregated, even though it was illegal. In Little Rock, Arkansas, this is probably a unit you have taught before, but it is absolutely central to emphasize. In Little Rock, the public high school there was beginning to implement a policy of desegregation very gradually. They were going to allow 9 students to enroll in the fall of 1957, but the demagogic governor of Arkansas, Orville Faubus, said, "I'm going to make some national headlines for myself by stopping the integration of this school." So he called out the National Guard, and he put a ring around that school, and the mob came out and helped him, and they intimidated the students so much they were unable to come into the high school to enroll and to begin classes. And this is where I think Dwight Eisenhower should get credit, because although he did not like doing this, he was, again, a conservative Republican. He believed in states' rights. In this case, he said, the governor of Arkansas is not going to make a fool out of the Supreme Court of the United States or me. We stand on the side of federal power in this case. The federal courts have decided that segregation in public schools is unconstitutional. I'm going to settle this on behalf of the federal government. He sent in the 101st Airborne. He nationalized the Arkansas National Guard, and he got those students into Little Rock High School. It's one of his greatest achievements, and I do believe it killed him to do it. And this is the tension, the contradiction of Eisenhower. He didn't think of himself as a civil rights hero. What he thought he was doing was protecting the integrity of the Supreme Court as the last word in federal law. He gave a famous speech to the country talking about his decision, and he really never mentioned race. He never mentioned the Little Rock Nine. He tried to avoid that issue and instead sell this as a story of federal versus state law. Nonetheless, he got the job done, and even to this day, we hold up the courage of the Little Rock Nine as so moving and inspirational in challenging unfair laws. The third theme, the third of my four themes, and I won't go on too much longer because I don't want to take up your time. That is so. I mean, it's just a low-hanging fruit when you're talking about the 1950s, and that is, you know, the theme of the American way of life. This is a vague theme, but it's one that's very inviting, I think, for students to come in and think about how did Americans view themselves in the decade of the 1950s. And one of the things that the phrase the American way of life was used a great deal in the 1950s to define America as distinct from communism, from the Soviet Union, but even as distinct from the old world of Europe. The American way of life was a vague term that was just meant to be something distinctive, exceptional, that was unique. And Americans couldn't define it exactly, but the popular culture gives us all kinds of clues to the things that Americans in the 1950s valued, the things that they believed, the things that they wanted and aspired to. And I just mention a few bullet points here. The kinds of things that came to define the American way of life in the decade of the 1950s are very much this attitude that we still maintain about this decade. One thing, of course, an obvious one that you can talk about with your students is television. Television is the epitome of the decade of the 1950s. You know, it becomes almost ubiquitous in American households in that decade, and it makes the home, it makes the living room the site of entertainment, the site of gathering. It makes all of the music and the films and the movies, all of that is now coming to you right inside your living room. Instead of you having to go out into the public sphere, into the movie theaters down at the local downtown, or into cafes and music halls. Now you can get all that right at home. How wonderful. You can be liberated from having to interact with anybody else. You can have television and entertainment brought right into your living room. This, of course, is just the beginning from where we are now today. But it does reshape American society about entertaining yourself inside the household. Another key emblem of the 1950s is the notion that every American should have a private automobile. This was a radical thing. I mean, in Europe, car ownership is far, far less than in America in the 1950s. Why should Americans have an automobile? Because it's an emblem of freedom. It's an emblem of liberty. You can get into that car and an adventure can begin anywhere. You can go anywhere. And you can ride in this supreme comfort over the millions of miles of interstate highways that were also built in the 1950s, that were designed and paid for and implemented, 40,000 miles of them, by Dwight Eisenhower starting in the 1950s. So the car and the highway became, you know, the epitome of American freedom, liberty, and prosperity. Of course, the rise of popular music in the 50s is something that you can easily use with students because the music is so good, and they probably heard a lot of it without even knowing when it came from or who even originally sang some of these songs. You know, Elvis Presley is obviously the sort of icon of the 1950s, but the key thing that you might be able to talk about is what kind of music is Elvis singing? And of course, he's singing Black R&B. He is making Black music popular for white suburbanites. He is the great translator of a Black music tradition into the living rooms of white people all across America, which is why he became so immensely popular. But so Elvis is a great source, both the songs and his appearance, the way he looked, the way he danced, which was all considered extremely radical at the time. A reminder that although the 60s we identify with cultural revolution, in the 50s, many of these transgressive behaviors, dancing on TV, for example, were starting to become common. Another theme you could talk about is the nuclear family, but in particular, the place of women. In many of these posters and images of the 1950s, you'll see that women inside kitchens talking to each other, here in this case, making cakes, etc. Women had been depicted very differently in the 1940s. You remember the Rosie the Riveter posters, the sense that a woman was strong, independent, was in the workforce. Now it's quite a different look. Now it's the 1950s. Women are back in the kitchen. They're back in the household. But look at the glamour. Look at the hairstyles. Look at the beautiful fashions. So women are being constructed in an entirely new way in the 1950s. And it is a way that is, basically profoundly anti-feminist. So that's another thing to think about. And then the last thing I'll say on this slide is the 1950s is a decade of a significant spike in religion. And here Eisenhower actually plays an important role. Eisenhower was from a Mennonite sect. He grew up in a very nonconformist religious environment, but he was deeply religious, but he was never baptized. Well, when he became president, he was baptized in 1953, the only president to be baptized while in office. He was a proselytizer of sorts, a kind of a general secular, like a non-denominational proselytizer. He started the prayer breakfasts. He made good friends with Billy Graham. He was the first president to bring that evangelical pastor into the White House and really, talk to him, learn from him, seek his advice. Eisenhower believed religion was central to the American experience. It made us different from the godless communists, but also he believed that America's purpose was, in a sense, to define godliness on earth. And he talked about it all the time. And it's no accident that in the 1950s, with Eisenhower's full support, the United States decided to put "In God We Trust" on the currency. And in the 1950s, the Congress chose to insert the term "under God" in the Pledge of Allegiance. These are artifacts of the 1950s. They were directly inspired by Eisenhower's own religious faith and his own belief that America was at its core a religious and spiritual nation, unlike the communists. So lots to work with in pop culture on the 50s. So again, the question that I think you could ask your students: how did Americans perceive themselves in the decade of the 50s? And then the last one, I'll just wrap up here. I don't want to go over time. This might appeal more to some of your science students, but the decade of the 1950s is a crucial one for big breakthroughs in scientific innovation and technology. This is partly triggered by the 1957 launch of Sputnik by the Soviet Union. This was a crisis in America because it looked like we'd fallen behind the Soviet Union. The Soviets got the first man-made satellite to orbit Earth in 1957. And this triggered a huge influx of federal dollars into the defense establishment to build our own satellite and our own rockets that could get those satellites into space. But also Eisenhower channeled millions and millions of dollars into science education, both in secondary school level and in universities through the National Defense Education Act. So the space race had a big impact on shaping how we did science, how universities and the government started to work very closely together. Of course, in 1958, Eisenhower launched NASA, created NASA, which was meant to be scientific only, not to have any military applications. But it was part of a gigantic effort of the US government to fund research into rocketry, missiles, and space, largely driven by defense concerns that if they didn't do this, the Soviets would rapidly get ahead in the arms race. Now, just one final little footnote here. Who's this man on the left? Werner Von Braun is a very interesting character because he was key in America's success. He helped to design the rockets, the intermediate range rockets that put the America satellite into space in 1958. And he went on to do a great deal of scientific engineering work on rocketry that would support the moon mission in the 1960s. But it's interesting that Werner von Braun started out in life as a German scientist working in Nazi Germany on behalf of the Nazi war effort. He helped to design the V2 rocket that was sent over into Britain with such devastating effects. So I mention this only as a way to connect World War II with the Cold War, the space race, and the technological innovations. There's a continuity there between the war effort of World War, the Nazi war effort of World War II, but also the jet age. And that's something I think you can unpack with your students. In particular, the question you could ask, how did the Cold War shape American science? That might be something you could work on as well. So I'm going to wrap up here. This is my last slide, and these are questions for you to discuss. As I understand it, you're going to do a breakout room thing and talk a little bit about the military-industrial complex speech that was circulated. These are some questions that you can discuss amongst yourselves. You might want to pick one rather than try to do them all. But this document, this speech, is so important it's one of the only things people really remember about Eisenhower is that he coined the term the military-industrial complex. But in this short speech are many of the themes that I've just mentioned. I mean, it ends with a long prayer. It's very religious in certain respects. It's also a lot about technological innovation, but it's also about democracy. How can America maintain itself as a democracy, as a country of innovation and individual liberty, while also becoming a gigantic military behemoth? How do we strike that balance? That is a problem, ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure you agree, we still struggle with. Maybe we have even lost the balance. But Eisenhower anticipated this. He anticipated that individual freedoms would always be in tension with the gigantic growth of the federal government, and in particular the military complex, the military scientific educational complex that was created as a result of the Cold War. In this sense, he was really, he had a lot of foresight that I think is worth thinking about and sharing with your students. That's enough for me.